The recruiter's sneer was audible even through the thick glass of the shooting range booth. Sarah Chin squinted at the eye chart, her weathered fingers gripping the edges of the metal chair as fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps. The letters blurred together in a familiar dance of frustration, each line becoming progressively more impossible to decipher. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Bottom line, Sergeant Matthews commanded from his position behind the desk, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had crushed dreams for 2 decades. Read it. Sarah's throat constricted. The letters swam before her eyes like fish in murky water, refusing to hold still long enough for her brain to process their meaning. Around her, other potential recruits shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, some barely suppressing snickers at the middle-aged woman who clearly didn't belong among the fresh-faced 18-year-olds seeking military careers. "I can't make out the bottom line clearly," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The laughter that erupted from the waiting area hit her like a physical blow. Matthews didn't even attempt to hide his contempt as he stamped her application with red ink that might as well have spelled out "rejected" in letters visible from space. But what none of them knew was that Sarah Chen had a secret that would shatter every assumption they'd made about vision, precision, and what it truly meant to see clearly under pressure. Sarah Chen had been stacking ammunition boxes at Precision Arms and Sporting Goods for 3 years, her movements efficient and practiced, despite the slight tremor in her hands that came from too much coffee and too little sleep. The sporting goods store sat on the outskirts of Millfield, Colorado, a town small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, yet somehow Sarah remained an enigma wrapped in flannel shirts and worn blue jeans. Her co-workers knew the basics. Divorced. No kids. Moved to town after some kind of accident that left her with a slight limp and an aversion to discussing her past. She lived alone in a converted barn on the Hendricks property, paying rent by helping with their horses when her leg allowed it. She drove a pickup truck older than most of the high school seniors who frequented the store, and she could identify any firearm by sound alone when someone worked the action. What they didn't know was that Sarah woke up at 4:30 every morning, not because she couldn't sleep, but because muscle memory from a previous life demanded it. Her small living space was arranged with military precision, every item in its designated place, every surface clean enough to perform surgery on. The few photographs scattered around showed landscapes rather than people, beautiful vistas that seemed chosen more for their tactical significance than their aesthetic appeal. The morning of the recruitment event, Sarah had arrived at work to find the store buzzing with unusual activity. A National Guard recruitment team had set up a temporary station in the parking lot, complete with pull-up bars, an eye chart station, and a small display of military equipment designed to entice young people toward service. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was watching potential soldiers being evaluated while she restocked the very ammunition they might one day use in training. Tom Bradley, the store manager, had been enthusiastic about hosting the recruiters. A former Marine himself, he believed in giving back to the community and supporting those who wanted to serve. He'd given Sarah the morning off to handle inventory while the recruitment activities took place outside, knowing she preferred to avoid crowds when possible. But curiosity had gotten the better of her. Through the store's large windows, she watched young men and women line up for physical tests, vision screenings, and preliminary interviews. Something stirred in her chest, a longing she'd buried so deep, she'd almost convinced herself it no longer existed. The structured chaos of military assessment brought back memories she'd worked hard to suppress, memories of a time when she'd been someone entirely different. The decision to join the line had been impulsive, almost reckless. She'd told herself she was just curious about the process, that she wanted to see how recruitment had changed since her time. But as she stood among teenagers and 20-somethings, she realized she was actually hoping for something she couldn't quite name. Validation, perhaps. Or maybe just the chance to feel useful again. The physical tests had gone better than expected. Despite her limp and her 42 years, Sarah's body remembered the discipline of military fitness. She completed the push-ups with form that impressed even the cocky recruiter timing her, finished the mile run in a respectable time despite favoring her left leg, and handled the basic coordination tests with an ease that made several younger candidates look clumsy by comparison. It was the vision test that destroyed everything. Sarah had always known her eyes were problematic. The injury that ended her previous career had affected more than just her leg, though she'd never discussed the full extent of her medical issues with anyone in Millfield. Her vision, while functional for daily activities, struggled with the sharp contrasts and precise focus required by standard military eye exams. Colors bled together at certain distances, fine details became fuzzy, and bright lights created halos that made reading small text nearly impossible. The recruiter conducting her vision screening was Sergeant First Class David Matthews, a man whose reputation for harsh assessments was legendary among Colorado National Guard circles. He approached each evaluation like a personal challenge, determined to weed out anyone he deemed unfit for service. His method was intimidation wrapped in regulation compliance, designed to break down candidates before they ever reached basic training. Matthews had taken one look at Sarah's age and civilian clothes and made his assessment before she ever sat down for testing. His questions were sharp, designed to embarrass rather than evaluate. Why was she wasting their time? Did she think the military was some kind of social program for people having midlife crises? Wouldn't she be better served finding age-appropriate hobbies instead of playing soldier? The vision test became a public spectacle. Matthews called out each line of letters loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear, his voice dripping with contempt as Sarah struggled to make out the smaller text. Other candidates stopped their own activities to watch the middle-aged woman fail what most considered the easiest part of the evaluation process. "Maybe you need to accept that some dreams have expiration dates," Matthews announced as he marked her paperwork with aggressive strokes of his pen. "The military needs soldiers, not charity cases." The gathered crowd's laughter felt like acid on Sarah's skin. She accepted the rejection paperwork with hands that didn't shake, thanked Matthews with a voice that didn't crack, and walked back toward the store with a dignity that didn't betray the humiliation burning in her chest. But inside, something had shifted. The careful balance she'd maintained for 3 years was beginning to crack, and memories she'd spent enormous energy suppressing were clawing their way back to the surface. What none of them understood was that Sarah Chen's vision problems had nothing to do with her ability to see what mattered. 22 years earlier, as Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen, she'd been one of the most decorated snipers in Army Special Operations. Her confirmed kill record remained classified, but the number was high enough to make seasoned warriors uncomfortable. She'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, accumulating commendations and psychological scars in equal measure. Her vision issues had developed after the incident that ended her career. An IED explosion that killed 2 of her teammates and left her with traumatic brain injury, chronic pain, and visual processing problems that made standard eye charts nearly impossible to read. But put a rifle in her hands and point her toward a target, and her brain compensated in ways that medical science couldn't fully explain. Her damaged eyes and traumatized neural pathways somehow combined to create a targeting system more precise than most computerized scopes. The explosion had taken her career, her identity, and her sense of purpose. The years since had been a careful process of rebuilding herself into someone who could function in civilian society, someone who wouldn't wake up screaming or instinctively reach for weapons that were no longer there. She'd become Sarah the store clerk, Sarah the horse helper, Sarah the quiet woman who kept to herself and bothered no one. But Sergeant Matthews' casual cruelty had awakened something that civilian life couldn't fully suppress. The warrior Sarah had been was still there, buried under years of careful normalcy, waiting for the right provocation to emerge, and now she had one. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine tasks performed with mechanical precision. She restocked shelves, processed paperwork, and helped customers with their purchases, all while her mind processed what had happened and what she was going to do about it. By closing time, she'd made a decision that would have terrified the careful, controlled person she'd become. She was going to show them exactly what kind of vision really mattered. That evening, Sarah drove to a location she hadn't visited in over a year. 20 miles outside Millfield, hidden in a valley that most locals didn't even know existed, was a private shooting range built by a group of military veterans who wanted a place to practice without civilian interference. The facility was off-limits to most people, but Sarah had earned access through a careful demonstration of both skill and discretion when she'd first moved to the area. The range master, a former Marine named Jake Morrison, had been expecting her. Word traveled fast in military circles. and the story of the middle-aged woman who'd been humiliated at the recruitment event had already made its way through the veteran grapevine. Jake had known Sarah's real background from their first meeting, recognized the signs of someone carrying classified secrets and invisible wounds. "Heard you had an interesting morning," he said as Sarah retrieved her rifle case from the truck. The weapon inside was unremarkable to civilian eyes, a standard hunting rifle that wouldn't attract attention in a community where most people own firearms. But Sarah had modified it with precision components that transformed it into something far more capable than its appearance suggested. "Matthews thinks vision is about reading letters on a wall," Sarah replied, her voice carrying an edge Jake hadn't heard before. Maybe it's time someone showed him what real vision looks like. The range had targets set at distances most civilian shooters never attempted. Sarah bypassed the standard 100 and 200-yard positions and walked directly to the 1,000-yard line. At that distance, the targets were barely visible to the naked eye, requiring optical enhancement and extraordinary skill to hit consistently. But Sarah's preparations suggested she had something even more ambitious in mind. She spent 30 minutes setting up her equipment with the methodical precision of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Her movements were economic, practiced, betraying none of the uncertainty that had marked her performance at the vision screening. This was her element, the place where her damaged brain and trained instincts combined to create something approaching perfection. Jake watched from the observation deck as Sarah settled into position. Even from his elevated vantage point, he could see the transformation that occurred when she took hold of her rifle. The slight tremor in her hands disappeared. Her breathing became deep and controlled. Her entire body language shifted from that of a small-town store clerk to something far more dangerous and competent. The first shot rang out across the valley like thunder. At 1,000 yards, the bullet took nearly 2 seconds to reach its target, time enough for wind, elevation, and a dozen other variables to affect its path. But Sarah's shot struck dead center, a precision that would have been impressive for any shooter under any circumstances. But that was just the beginning of what she had planned to demonstrate. Over the next hour, Sarah systematically worked through distances that pushed the boundaries of what most considered possible with her equipment. 1,200 yards, 1,500, 1,800. Each shot required calculations that she performed instinctively, adjustments for wind speed, barometric pressure, temperature, and the Coriolis effect that influenced bullet trajectory over extreme distances. Jake documented each shot with a spotting scope and rangefinder, his amazement growing with each impossible hit. This wasn't lucky shooting or even exceptional skill by normal standards. This was something approaching the supernatural, precision that belonged in record books rather than private demonstrations. At 2,000 yards, Sarah paused. At that distance, she was pushing beyond the effective range of her equipment and into territory where only the most elite military snipers ever operated. The target was invisible to the naked eye, a small steel plate that required perfect technique and considerable luck to hit under ideal conditions. "You sure about this?" Jake called down from his position. "That's beyond what anyone expects." Sarah's response was to adjust her scope and settle back into position. Her breathing slowed to the rhythmic pattern that preceded her most difficult shots. For nearly 3 minutes she remained motionless, reading wind conditions, calculating trajectory, waiting for the perfect moment when all variables aligned. The shot was perfect. At 2,000 yards, through wind conditions that would have defeated most shooters at half the distance, her bullet struck the target with a ringing sound that carried across the valley like a bell. Jake's rangefinder confirmed what his spotting scope had shown, a center hit at a distance most people couldn't even see clearly. But Sarah wasn't finished. She had one more demonstration in mind, something that would prove beyond any doubt that her vision problems had nothing to do with her ability to see what truly mattered. She loaded a final cartridge and settled into position one last time, but instead of aiming at a stationary target, she waited. In the distance, barely visible even through high-powered optics, a small aircraft was making its scheduled evening flight over the valley. It was completely legal, a private pilot following a route he'd flown hundreds of times before. But for Sarah, it represented the ultimate test of her abilities. At 2,300 yards, accounting for the aircraft's speed and direction, she would attempt something that existed in the realm of legend rather than reality. A shot at a moving target at a distance where the bullet's flight time would require her to aim at empty air, trusting physics and instinct to bring projectile and target together in a convergence point she could only calculate in her mind. Jake realized what she was attempting and felt his blood run cold. "Sarah, that's impossible. Even if you could make the shot, it's exactly what vision really means," she interrupted, her voice calm as still water. "It's seeing not just what's there, but what's going to be there. It's understanding that sometimes the most important things can't be measured on a chart." The aircraft was approaching the optimal point for her calculations. Sarah controlled her breathing, made final adjustments to her scope, and prepared to demonstrate the difference between reading letters on a wall and truly seeing the world with warrior's eyes. The shot, when it came, would redefine everything Matthews and the others thought they knew about vision, precision, and what it meant to be a soldier. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But that moment was still seconds away, and those seconds contained the weight of every assumption that had been made about the middle-aged woman who couldn't pass a simple eye exam. In those final seconds before her rifle spoke, Sarah Chen existed in the space between who she appeared to be and who she really was, poised to bridge that gap with a single, impossible shot. The warrior that civilian life had tried to bury was about to announce her return in the most spectacular way possible. The morning after Sarah's demonstration at the private range, Millfield woke to rumors that spread through coffee shops and hardware stores like wildfire. Jake Morrison had kept his word about discretion, but in a town of 3,000 people, secrets had a way of mutating into legends before lunchtime. By the time Sarah arrived at Precision Arms and Sporting Goods, half the town was convinced she'd either performed some kind of miracle or Jake had been drinking again. Tom Bradley, the store manager, cornered her before she could even clock in. His weathered face showed the kind of confusion that came from trying to reconcile what he thought he knew with what he'd been hearing all morning. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me," Tom said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent 20 years in the Marines and thought he could read people accurately. "Jake Morrison called me at 6 this morning. He was either lying, crazy, or you did something yesterday that I can't even wrap my head around." Sarah hung her jacket on the employee hook with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. Her face betrayed nothing, the expression of someone who'd spent years learning to keep secrets locked behind neutral features. "Jake likes to tell stories," she replied, moving toward the ammunition inventory she'd been working on the previous day. "You know how veterans get when they start talking about shooting. Everything becomes bigger and more impressive in the telling." But Tom wasn't satisfied with deflection. He'd known Jake for 15 years, and while the former Marine might embellish details about fish or poker games, he was religiously accurate when it came to firearms and marksmanship. If Jake said something extraordinary had happened at his range, then something extraordinary had happened. He says you made shots that shouldn't be possible. Says you hit targets at distances most people need artillery for. Tom's voice dropped to a whisper, even though they were alone in the store. "He says you shot at something moving at over 2,000 yards and connected." "That's not storytelling, Sarah. That's either delusion or something I need to understand." The weight of the moment settled between them like dust in sunlight. Sarah had known this conversation would come eventually. In a small town, extraordinary events demanded explanations, and she'd just performed something that fell well outside the boundaries of ordinary experience. The careful anonymity she'd maintained for 3 years was cracking under the pressure of her own capabilities. "Some things are better left as stories, Tom," she said finally, her voice carrying a finality that discouraged further questions. "I came here to stock shelves and help customers, not to be anyone special. I'd like to keep it that way." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew her carefully constructed civilian life was already changing. The demonstration at Jake's range had been cathartic, a release of tension that had been building since Sergeant Matthews' humiliation. But it had also been a declaration, an announcement that the warrior she'd tried to bury was still very much alive. And warriors, she was beginning to remember, couldn't stay hidden forever. The first sign of the storm approaching came in the form of a phone call that interrupted Sarah's lunch break. Tom answered with his usual professional greeting, but his expression shifted quickly from routine customer service to something approaching alarm. "Yes, sir, she works here," he said into the phone, his eyes finding Sarah across the store. May I ask what this is regarding? Sarah's blood turned to ice water as she watched Tom's face go pale. She'd received calls like this before, years ago when her previous life had occasionally intersected with civilian authorities. The tone in Tom's voice, the formal language he was suddenly using, the way his military bearing unconsciously straightened, all indicated that someone with serious authority was asking serious questions. I understand, sir. Yes, she's available. Hold on, just a moment. Tom covered the phone's mouthpiece with his hand and looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't suspicion, exactly, but it was the look of a man who was beginning to realize that his quiet employee carried secrets far more complex than he'd imagined. It's Colonel Patricia Morrison, Colorado National Guard. She wants to speak with you directly. Tom's voice carried the automatic respect that 20 years of Marine service had ingrained in him. She says it's regarding your application yesterday. The surname Morrison struck Sarah like a physical blow. Jake Morrison, the range master who'd witnessed her demonstration, had a relative in the National Guard command structure. The implications cascaded through her mind like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. Her background investigation would begin within hours. Her carefully constructed civilian identity would crumble under military-grade scrutiny. The life she'd built in Millfield was about to end, and she had no one to blame but herself. Sarah took the phone with hands that appeared steady but felt like they were shaking internally. This is Sarah Chen. Ms. Chen, this is Colonel Morrison. I understand you visited one of our recruitment events yesterday. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, carrying the kind of authority that came from years of command responsibility. I'd like to discuss your application and some additional information that's come to my attention. I was rejected, ma'am. Failed the vision screening. Sarah's response was automatic, the truth delivered without emotion or explanation. Yes, I'm aware of Sergeant Matthews' assessment. I'm also aware of some activities you engaged in yesterday evening that suggest his evaluation might have been incomplete. The pause that followed was loaded with implications. I think we need to have a conversation, Ms. Chen, a private conversation about your background and your current situation. The meeting was arranged for that evening at the National Guard Armory in Grand Junction, an hour's drive from Millfield. Sarah would come alone, bring identification, and be prepared for what Colonel Morrison termed a comprehensive discussion about your qualifications and history. After hanging up, Sarah stood in the middle of the sporting goods store, surrounded by the civilian life she'd built, and felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in. The careful balance she'd maintained for 3 years was collapsing, and she was powerless to stop the avalanche that her own actions had triggered. Tom approached cautiously, his expression showing the concern of someone who cared about an employee, but was beginning to suspect that employee carried complications far beyond his understanding. Sarah, I don't know what's going on, but if you're in some kind of trouble, if there's something I should know, there's nothing you can do, Tom. Sarah's voice carried a finality that discouraged argument. Some things from the past have a way of catching up, no matter how far you run or how well you hide. That afternoon, Sarah worked with mechanical efficiency, helping customers and processing inventory while her mind prepared for the evening's confrontation. She'd known this day might come eventually. The skills that had made her valuable to the military weren't the kind that simply disappeared with time or disuse. They were hardwired into her nervous system, carved into her muscle memory through years of training and application that civilian life could mask but never truly erase. The drive to Grand Junction gave her time to think, time to prepare for questions she'd hoped never to answer again. The Colorado landscape rolled past her truck's windows, familiar yet suddenly foreign, as if she were seeing it for the last time as the person she'd pretended to be for 3 years. The National Guard Armory was a utilitarian building that managed to look both welcoming and intimidating, depending on your relationship with military authority. Sarah parked in the visitor section and walked toward the main entrance with the measured pace of someone who understood military protocol but wasn't eager to re-engage with it. Colonel Patricia Morrison was waiting in a conference room that had been cleared of other personnel. She was a woman in her late 40s with the bearing of someone who'd earned her rank through competence rather than politics. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture perfect, but her eyes showed the kind of intelligence that suggested she understood the complexities of the situation she was about to navigate. Ms. Chen, please sit down. Morrison's voice was professional but not unfriendly. Can I offer you coffee? Water? Sarah declined and took the offered seat, automatically positioning herself where she could see both the door and the windows. Old habits from a previous life that civilian experience hadn't managed to override. "Let's start with what I know," Morrison continued, opening a folder that was conspicuously thin. "You applied for National Guard service yesterday. You're 42 years old, divorced, currently employed at a sporting goods store in Millfield. You failed the vision screening administered by Sergeant Matthews." She paused, studying Sarah's face for reaction. "You also spent yesterday evening at a private shooting range where you demonstrated marksmanship abilities that are, according to my source, quite extraordinary." Sarah remained silent, understanding that Morrison was building towards something and that premature responses would only complicate the situation. "My brother Jake owns that range," Morrison continued. "He's also a former Marine with extensive combat experience. When he calls me at 5 in the morning to tell me someone just performed what he describes as impossible shots, I pay attention. When that someone is a middle-aged woman who was rejected for military service 12 hours earlier, I become very curious indeed." The folder Morrison opened contained only a few sheets of paper, but Sarah recognized the format of military personnel records. Her carefully constructed civilian identity was about to collide with whatever fragments of her real history had survived classification and time. Sarah Chen, currently of Millfield, Colorado, no military service record, no advanced training certifications, no explanation for how someone with no apparent background could demonstrate the kind of precision shooting that my brother witnessed. Morrison leaned forward, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to something approaching intensity. "Except that's not the whole truth, is it?" Sarah had prepared for this moment during the drive, but facing it directly was different from imagining it. The weight of 3 years of careful anonymity hung in the balance, along with whatever remained of her previous identity's classified existence. "I learned to shoot growing up in rural Montana," she said finally, delivering the cover story she'd rehearsed but never had to use. "My father was a hunter. I spent a lot of time at the range before I moved to Colorado." Morrison's expression suggested she found the explanation inadequate. "Ms. Chen, I've been in the military for 24 years. I've worked with some of the finest marksmen this country has ever produced. What my brother described isn't the result of weekend hunting trips or casual range practice. What he described is the kind of precision that comes from specialized training and extensive combat experience." The silence that followed stretched between them like a fault line. Sarah could feel the careful structures of her civilian life cracking under the pressure of Morrison's scrutiny. But she also sensed something else in the colonel's approach. This wasn't an interrogation designed to expose and punish. This felt more like recruitment, an attempt to understand capabilities rather than condemn them. "Let me ask you a different question," Morrison continued. "Are you familiar with the Army's Special Operations Sniper Program?" The question hit Sarah like electricity. Morrison was fishing in waters that should have been sealed by classification levels and need-to-know restrictions. Either the colonel had access to information she shouldn't have, or Sarah's carefully buried past was bleeding through the barriers that were supposed to keep it hidden. "I've heard of it," Sarah replied carefully, her voice betraying nothing of the alarm bells ringing in her mind. "The program produced some remarkable individuals over the years. Men and women whose service records are so classified that most of their achievements will never be publicly acknowledged. Some of them served multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. Some of them accumulated confirmed kill records that would be legendary if they weren't sealed in classified files." Morrison paused, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. "Some of them were injured in the line of duty and medically retired with benefits that ensured their subsequent anonymity." Sarah felt the walls of her carefully constructed civilian identity crumbling around her. Morrison wasn't guessing or fishing for information. She knew exactly who Sarah had been, and she was offering her a choice between continued denial and honest conversation about what came next. "I don't know what you want me to say, Colonel. I want you to tell me the truth about who you are and what you're capable of. Because if you're who I think you are, then yesterday's demonstration at my brother's range was just the beginning of a conversation this country needs to have with you." Morrison opened a second folder, this one noticeably thicker than the first. Sarah recognized the format immediately. Classified personnel files that should have been accessible only to individuals with specific clearances and demonstrated need to know. The fact that Morrison had obtained them meant that Sarah's situation had escalated far beyond local National Guard recruitment. Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen, Army Special Operations. 3 tours Afghanistan, 2 tours Iraq. Specialized in long-range reconnaissance and precision elimination of high-value targets. Confirmed kill record classified, but reportedly in excess of 100 enemy combatants eliminated at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Morrison's voice carried the respect of one professional warrior addressing another. Medically retired following IED injuries sustained while protecting civilian evacuees in Kandahar province. Awarded Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, and several commendations that remain classified. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a controlled explosion. Sarah's throat felt dry as the carefully buried memories of who she'd been rose to the surface, bringing with them the weight of everything she'd tried to leave behind. "That person doesn't exist anymore," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent years trying to escape their own history. "She died in Afghanistan along with her teammates. The person sitting here is just a store clerk who wants to be left alone." Morrison's expression softened slightly, showing understanding that came from years of working with veterans who carried invisible wounds. "I understand why you'd want to believe that, Miss Chen, but yesterday evening proved that the warrior you used to be is still very much alive. The question now is what we do with that reality." Morrison closed the files and leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from interrogation to something approaching mentorship. "The National Guard has need for individuals with your particular skill set. Not for traditional deployment, you understand, but for specialized training roles and certain operations that require discretion and precision." Morrison paused, choosing her words carefully. "We can offer you a position that would utilize your abilities while respecting your need for privacy. A chance to serve again without sacrificing the civilian life you've built." Sarah felt the familiar pull of purpose, the magnetic attraction of meaningful work that had drawn her into military service originally. But she also remembered the cost of that service, the psychological toll of being responsible for life and death decisions in situations where moral clarity was often an expensive luxury. What kind of operations? Morrison's smile suggested she'd expected that question. Counter-terrorism activities on American soil, training elite units in precision marksmanship, occasional consultation on threat assessment and target elimination scenarios. All completely legal, all officially sanctioned, all carried out with the kind of discretion that protects both the mission and the individuals involved. The offer was tempting in ways Sarah hadn't expected. The chance to use skills that had defined her identity for so many years, to feel useful again in ways that mattered beyond customer service and inventory management. But it also represented a step back toward a world she'd spent 3 years learning to live without. "I need time to think about this." Morrison nodded, understanding that such decisions couldn't be made lightly. "Of course. But I should mention that your demonstration yesterday has attracted attention beyond just my brother and myself. Certain federal agencies are very interested in individuals who can perform the kind of precision shooting you exhibited. If you're not interested in working with us, you may find yourself having similar conversations with people who are less considerate of your desire for privacy." The threat was delivered gently, but it was unmistakably a threat. Sarah's extraordinary demonstration had blown her cover in ways that couldn't be undone. Her choice now was between controlled re-engagement with her previous world or forced exposure to scrutiny she couldn't escape. "How long do I have to decide?" 48 hours. After that, other interested parties are going to start asking questions that I won't be able to deflect." Morrison stood, extending her hand in a gesture that was part military courtesy and part genuine respect. "For what it's worth, Ms. Chen, this country needs people like you. People who understand that freedom sometimes requires individuals willing to do difficult things in difficult circumstances." Sarah shook the offered hand and left the armory with her mind spinning through implications and possibilities. The drive back to Millfield gave her time to process what had just happened, but not enough time to decide what came next. The warrior she'd tried to bury was being called back to service, and the careful balance she'd maintained between past and present was about to be permanently disrupted. Whether that disruption led to redemption or destruction remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. The shot that had connected with its target at 2,300 yards had done more than demonstrate her continued capabilities. It had announced her return to a world she'd never truly left, a world that was now demanding her full participation once again. The ghost of her former self was about to become fully corporeal, and Sarah Chen, store clerk from Millfield, Colorado, was about to disappear forever into the classified world where legends were born and heroes remained forever anonymous. The 48-hour deadline Colonel Morrison had imposed hung over Sarah like a storm front moving across the Colorado plains. She returned to work the next morning carrying the weight of decisions that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her carefully constructed civilian existence. But her external demeanor remained as composed as always. Tom Bradley watched her with the heightened awareness of someone who sensed dramatic change approaching but couldn't identify its exact nature. The sporting goods store felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had contracted overnight to accommodate the expanding reality of who Sarah really was beneath her clerk's uniform. Every familiar task carried new significance as she processed the possibility that this might be among her final days performing routine civilian work. The ammunition she stocked, the firearms she helped customers select, the hunting licenses she processed, all connected to a world she understood from perspectives her customers couldn't imagine. Around midday, the store's atmosphere shifted with the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Sergeant Matthews entered with the swagger of someone accustomed to immediate deference, his National Guard uniform crisp, despite the desert heat, his expression carrying the casual arrogance that had made Sarah's recruitment experience so humiliating. Tom Bradley straightened automatically, military bearing asserting itself despite years of civilian employment. Matthews surveyed the store with proprietary interest, his gaze cataloging inventory and personnel, with the systematic approach of someone conducting an unofficial inspection. When his attention settled on Sarah, his expression shifted to something between amusement and disdain, as if encountering a discredited adversary in circumstances that confirmed his original assessment. "Well, well," Matthews announced loud enough for other customers to hear. "If it isn't our middle-aged recruit who couldn't read an eye chart. Still playing with toy soldiers, I see." Sarah continued arranging rifle scopes in their display case, her movements steady and precise despite the tension that immediately filled the space around her. Tom Bradley shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, recognizing the potential for confrontation but uncertain about the dynamics at play. Matthews approached the display case where Sarah worked, his boots striking the floor with deliberate emphasis. "I heard some interesting rumors about you, Chen. Something about thinking you're some kind of sharpshooter." His voice carried the practiced condescension of someone who enjoyed public humiliation as a recreational activity. Funny how people who can't handle basic military requirements suddenly become legends in their own minds. The other customers in the store began to take notice of the confrontation developing near the firearms display. Matthews seemed to feed on the growing audience, his voice rising with each comment as he warmed to his performance. "You know what I think happened?" Matthews continued, positioning himself where Sarah couldn't ignore his presence. "I think you went out to some range, maybe paid someone to let you shoot at big targets close up, and now you're telling people you're Annie Oakley. That's what happens when people can't accept reality about their limitations." Sarah's hands paused momentarily in their work, the first visible sign that Matthews' provocation was having any effect. But instead of responding with anger or defensive explanations, she simply continued organizing merchandise with the same methodical precision that characterized everything she did. The sergeant's frustration with her lack of response manifested as escalating aggression. "I'm talking to you, Chen. When someone who actually serves this country addresses you, the polite thing is to acknowledge them. Or didn't they teach basic courtesy in whatever online fantasy camp gave you delusions about being military material?" Tom Bradley finally intervened, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak to Matthews as an equal. "Sergeant, I'm going to have to ask you to conduct yourself appropriately in my store. Miss Chen is my employee, and she deserves respectful treatment." Matthews turned his attention to Tom, with the dismissive expression reserved for civilians who presume to lecture active military personnel. "With all due respect, Marine, you don't know what kind of person you've got working here. This woman wasted valuable recruitment time and resources with some fantasy about being soldier material. She filled the most basic evaluation requirements, and now she's apparently spreading stories about having some kind of special abilities." The confrontation was drawing attention from throughout the store. Customers had stopped their shopping to observe the increasingly heated exchange. and Sarah found herself once again at the center of public scrutiny, designed to expose her perceived inadequacies. But something fundamental had changed since her humiliation at the recruitment event. The conversation with Colonel Morrison had forced Sarah to confront the reality that her past wasn't as buried as she'd believed. The skills and instincts that had defined her military career were still present, still functional, still waiting for the right circumstances to assert themselves. And Matthew's casual cruelty was providing exactly those circumstances. Sarah straightened slowly, setting down the scope she'd been arranging and turning to face Matthews with the kind of focused attention that made several customers unconsciously step backward. Her expression remained calm, but something in her posture suggested that the dynamic of their interaction was about to shift dramatically. "You're absolutely right, Sergeant," Sarah said, her voice carrying a quality that made everyone in the vicinity stop what they were doing to listen. "I did fail your vision test. Those little letters on your chart were impossible for me to read clearly." Matthews smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose point had been conceded. "Finally, a little honesty about your limitations. But you know what's interesting about vision?" Sarah continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the tension crackling through the air around her. "There are different kinds of seeing. There's the kind that lets you read letters on a wall in good lighting, with plenty of time to focus. And then there's the kind that lets you identify threats at distances most people can't even imagine." Sarah moved toward the store's front window, gesturing for Matthews to follow. The gathered customers shifted to maintain visual contact with what was developing into the most interesting confrontation Millfield had witnessed in years. "See that water tower on the horizon?" Sarah pointed toward a structure barely visible in the distance, a tiny cylinder that most people would dismiss as insignificant background scenery. "That's approximately 1,800 meters from here. Can you make out any details on it?" Matthews squinted in the direction Sarah indicated, his expression showing the strain of trying to identify features at a distance that challenged normal visual acuity. "I can see there's something there. What's your point?" "My point is that vision isn't just about reading charts in controlled environments. It's about seeing what matters when everything is on the line." Sarah's voice carried a quality that suggested she was building towards something significant. "You want to know about my vision problems? Let me show you exactly what they mean." Sarah walked to the store's gun safe and retrieved her personal rifle, the same weapon she'd used for her demonstration at Jake Morrison's range. The gathered crowd watched with growing anticipation as she checked the action and confirmed the weapon was unloaded. Tom Bradley looked alarmed at the direction events were taking. "Sarah, I don't think this is a good idea." "Maybe we should." "It's fine, Tom," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that was completely different from her usual soft-spoken demeanor. "The sergeant here thinks I'm delusional about my capabilities. I think it's time we settled that question definitively." Matthew's expression showed a mixture of excitement and skepticism as he realized Sarah was apparently preparing to attempt some kind of shooting demonstration. The prospect of witnessing her public failure at an impossible task appealed to his desire for vindication and entertainment. "You're going to shoot at something from inside a store?" Matthews asked, his voice carrying mocking disbelief. "What exactly do you think you're going to accomplish?" Sarah smiled with an expression that several customers later described as simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. "I'm going to show you what real vision looks like. But first, I need to make a phone call." She retrieved her cell phone and dialed a number from memory, speaking briefly with whoever answered. The conversation was too quiet for others to overhear, but her tone suggested she was arranging something specific and immediate. "Jake, it's Sarah. I need you to set up the mobile target system at your range and position it at grid reference 77 Alpha. Yes, right now. And Jake, make sure you're recording this. I have a feeling documentation is going to be important." After ending the call, Sarah turned back to Matthews with an expression that had shifted from defensive compliance to something approaching predatory focus. "Sergeant, you've questioned my vision and my capabilities in front of witnesses. I think it's only fair that I demonstrate exactly what those capabilities entail." Matthew's confidence began to waver as he processed the implications of Sarah's preparations. "You can't seriously be planning to shoot from here. That's got to be illegal, dangerous." "Actually, it's perfectly legal," Tom Bradley interjected, his expression showing the dawning realization that his quiet employee was about to do something extraordinary. "This is Colorado, Sergeant. Private property, proper safety precautions, licensed firearms. As long as she's not endangering anyone, she's within her rights." Sarah opened the store's front door, positioning herself where she had a clear line of sight toward the distant range. The gathered crowd pressed closer, sensing they were about to witness something remarkable, though none could have imagined the true scope of what Sarah was preparing to demonstrate. The target Jake is setting up is a regulation military silhouette moving on a predetermined track at varying speeds, Sarah explained, as she settled into a shooting position that looked both comfortable and impossibly precise. It's located at 2,300 meters from this position, which puts it beyond the effective range of most military sniper systems. Matthews' skepticism was evident in his expression, but something in Sarah's demeanor was beginning to convince him that she wasn't bluffing about her intentions or her capabilities. Even if there is a target out there, even if you could see it clearly, the ballistics alone make what you're suggesting impossible, Matthews protested, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. Sarah's response was to begin making calculations that she spoke aloud for the benefit of her audience. Wind speed approximately 12 miles per hour from the southwest. Temperature 84 degrees Fahrenheit. Barometric pressure standard for this elevation. Humidity approximately 30%. She paused, making mental calculations that accounted for variables most people had never heard of. Coriolis effect for this latitude and range will deflect the projectile approximately 4 inches to the right. Total flight time to target will be approximately 2.7 seconds. The technical precision of her analysis made it clear that Sarah understood ballistics at a level far beyond casual recreational shooting. Matthews found himself listening with the growing realization that he was observing someone with knowledge that came from extensive professional training and practical application. The target will be moving at approximately 15 miles per hour in a pattern that changes direction every 30 seconds, Sarah continued, settling behind her rifle with movements that looked both natural and impossibly controlled. To compensate for target movement and projectile flight time, I'll need to aim at a point approximately 40 feet ahead of where the target appears to be when I pull the trigger. Sarah's breathing shifted to the controlled pattern that preceded her most demanding shots. Her entire body seemed to settle into a state of perfect stillness, as if she'd become an extension of the rifle rather than simply someone holding it. The interesting thing about vision problems, she said, her voice remaining conversational despite the extraordinary precision of her shooting position, is that they don't necessarily affect your ability to see what really matters. Brain injuries can scramble the pathways that process simple visual information while leaving the systems that handle complex targeting completely intact. Matthews watched with growing amazement as Sarah's explanation made it clear that her vision difficulties were not weaknesses but adaptations, modifications that had transformed her visual processing into something specialized and extraordinarily effective under specific circumstances. Military snipers learn to see differently than civilians, Sarah continued, her scope trained on a target none of the observers could even identify. We learn to read wind patterns from vegetation movement, to calculate distance from atmospheric haze, to predict target behavior from environmental factors. We learn to see not just what's there, but what's going to be there. The gathered crowd had grown silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something far beyond normal experience. Even Matthews had stopped his commentary, focused entirely on Sarah's preparations for what was shaping up to be the most remarkable demonstration of marksmanship anyone in Millfield had ever witnessed. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Jake Morrison confirming that the target system was active and recording. The moment of truth was approaching, and everyone present seemed to understand that what happened next would either validate Sarah's claims or expose them as elaborate delusion. "Sergeant Matthews," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the enormous pressure of public scrutiny. "You questioned my vision because I couldn't read letters on your chart. You suggested that military service requires abilities I don't possess. You humiliated me in front of people who deserved better than witnessing your unprofessional behavior." Matthews opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah continued before he could speak. "In 30 seconds, I'm going to fire one shot at a target moving at 2,300 meters. The target is approximately the size of a human torso, moving at 15 miles per hour in unpredictable patterns. The shot will require me to account for wind, elevation, atmospheric conditions, target movement, and ballistic trajectory while dealing with vision problems that make your eye chart impossible to read." Sarah's finger moved to the trigger with the practiced precision of someone who'd performed this action thousands of times, in circumstances where failure meant death. "When that shot connects with its target, I want you to remember something important. The vision that matters in military service isn't about reading charts in comfortable offices. It's about seeing clearly when lives depend on your precision, when failure isn't an option, and when the only thing standing between success and catastrophe is your ability to do the impossible when it absolutely must be done. The rifle's report echoed across the valley like thunder, the sound sharp and definitive in the afternoon air. For nearly 3 seconds, the entire crowd remained frozen, waiting for confirmation of what had just occurred at a distance none of them could fully comprehend. Sarah's phone rang with a call from Jake Morrison, and she answered with the casual composure of someone who'd just completed a routine task, rather than attempted something approaching the supernatural. "Perfect center hit." Jake's voice was loud enough for several people to hear through the phone. "Dead center of the target, moving at full speed 2,300 meters. I've got it recorded from 3 angles, and I can barely believe what I just witnessed." The silence that followed Jake's confirmation was profound and complete. Every person present understood that they'd witnessed something that redefined their understanding of human capability, precision, and the meaning of exceptional performance under pressure. Matthews stared at Sarah with an expression that cycled through disbelief, amazement, and something approaching horror as he processed the implications of what had just occurred. The middle-aged woman he'd dismissed as delusional had just performed a shot that would be considered remarkable under ideal conditions at a military training facility, and she'd done it from a sporting goods store in front of witnesses who could verify every detail. "Who are you?" Matthews asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah began disassembling her rifle with the efficient movements of someone returning to routine after completing necessary work. "I'm exactly who I've always been, Sergeant. Someone whose vision problems don't affect the things that really matter." Tom Bradley approached with the expression of someone whose understanding of the world had just been fundamentally altered. "Sarah, I don't understand what just happened, but I know it was something extraordinary, something that changes everything about who you are and what you're capable of." Sarah looked around at the gathered crowd, recognizing that her carefully maintained anonymity was permanently shattered. The demonstration had achieved its purpose of vindicating her abilities and exposing Matthew's unprofessional behavior, but it had also announced her presence to anyone with the resources to investigate extraordinary marksmanship demonstrations. "What just happened?" Sarah said, her voice carrying the finality of someone who'd made an irrevocable decision, "is that I stopped pretending to be someone I'm not. For 3 years, I've been hiding from my past, trying to convince myself that I could be normal, ordinary, forgettable. But some things don't stay buried, no matter how deep you try to bury them." Matthews struggled to process the revelation that the woman he'd humiliated possessed capabilities far beyond anything he'd encountered in his military career. "You're military. Special operations. You have to be." "I was military," Sarah corrected, her tone matter-of-fact, despite the weight of what she was acknowledging. "I was someone who understood that service sometimes requires you to do difficult things, in difficult circumstances. I was someone whose vision problems never affected my ability to see what needed to be done and do it." Sarah's phone buzzed with another text message, this one from Colonel Morrison. The message was brief but significant. "Impressive demonstration. Federal interest confirmed. Decision time accelerated. Call immediately." The convergence of events Sarah had been dreading was now unavoidable. Her extraordinary shooting demonstration had been witnessed by too many people, documented too thoroughly, performed too publicly to be dismissed or forgotten. Whatever remained of her carefully constructed civilian life was about to be consumed by the reality of who she'd always been beneath the surface. "I need to make some calls," Sarah announced to the gathered crowd. "Tom, I'm going to need some time off, possibly permanently." Tom Bradley nodded, with the understanding that came from recognizing when situations had moved beyond normal employment considerations. "Whatever you need, Sarah. After what I just witnessed, I think normal workplace policies don't really apply anymore." Sarah left the sporting goods store with the awareness that she would likely never return as the person she'd been for the past 3 years. The warrior she'd tried to bury was fully resurrected now, called back to service by circumstances that made continued hiding impossible. The drive to her small apartment gave her time to process what had just occurred and what came next. Her demonstration had been more than vindication of her abilities. It had been a declaration of war against the assumptions and limitations others had tried to impose on her. Sergeant Matthews had learned that vision was about far more than reading charts, and Sarah had learned that some battles couldn't be won through retreat and anonymity. Her phone rang as she reached her apartment, the caller ID showing Colonel Morrison's number. The The conversation that followed would determine whether Sarah's future involved controlled re-engagement with her previous world or forced exposure to scrutiny she couldn't escape. "Congratulations, Ms. Chen." Morrison's voice carried a mixture of admiration and concern. "That was either the most impressive demonstration of marksmanship I've ever heard about, or the most spectacularly public end to a covert career in recent memory." Sarah understood the implications immediately. Her public demonstration had been witnessed by too many people, recorded too thoroughly, to be contained or managed through traditional operational security measures. "I made my choice, Colonel. The hiding is over." "Yes, it appears that it is. The question now is whether you're ready to deal with the consequences of that choice." Federal agencies are very interested in someone who can perform the kind of precision shooting you just demonstrated. Your previous service record has been flagged for review, and there are people who want to have conversations about your current status and future availability. Sarah felt the familiar weight of involuntary recruitment settling around her like gravity. The skills that had defined her military career were valuable enough to make voluntary retirement a temporary luxury rather than a permanent option. "What are my choices?" Morrison's pause suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "You can work with us voluntarily, accepting a position that utilizes your abilities while respecting your need for some degree of privacy. Or you can wait for other agencies to make their own offers, which are likely to be less considerate of your personal preferences." The choice was the same one Morrison had presented during their first meeting, but the circumstances had changed dramatically. Sarah's public demonstration had eliminated the possibility of continued anonymity, making her previous life of careful obscurity impossible to maintain. "When do you need an answer?" "Now would be good. The longer we wait, the more interested parties are going to become involved in this decision. And some of those parties have resources and authority that make resistance difficult." Sarah looked around her small apartment, recognizing that the life she'd built there was already over regardless of what choice she made. The warrior she'd tried to bury had been fully resurrected by her own actions, and that warrior belonged to a world of classified missions and necessary violence that civilian existence couldn't accommodate. "I accept your offer, Colonel, but I have conditions." Morrison's relief was audible in her voice. "I'm listening." "I maintain operational autonomy. I choose my assignments, my methods, and my level of involvement. No one gets to dictate how I use abilities that cost me everything to develop." "Agreed. What else?" "The people in Millfield who witnessed today's demonstration deserve protection from the kind of scrutiny that follows people like me. They're innocent civilians who happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I want guarantees that they won't be harassed or investigated because of what they saw." Morrison's pause suggested she was considering the feasibility of Sarah's demand. "That can be arranged. Federal agencies understand the need to protect civilian witnesses when operational security is involved." "Then we have an agreement. When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning. There's a situation developing that requires someone with your particular skill set. Are you ready to be operational again?" 10 years had passed since Captain Elena Vasquez had been stripped of her wings, and the world of military aviation had been quietly transformed by the ripple effects of her unauthorized rescue mission. What began as a single act of defiance had evolved into a movement that challenged fundamental assumptions about military service, institutional loyalty, and the moral obligations of those who served in uniform. At the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Cadet First Class Jennifer Morrison stood before her ethics class presenting a case study that had become central to military education. The young woman, who would graduate in 3 months with a commission as a second lieutenant, was analyzing the same moral complexities that had destroyed Elena's career, but she was doing so in an environment that had been forever changed by Elena's example. Morrison's presentation focused on the doctrine of moral injury within military service, a concept that had gained recognition partly due to the attention Elena's case had brought to the psychological cost of forcing service members to choose between following orders and protecting human life. The cadet's analysis was sophisticated and nuanced, reflecting a generation of future officers who had grown up with Elena's story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind obedience. The instructor, Colonel David Park, was himself a veteran of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, who had witnessed firsthand the kind of moral complexities that Elena had faced. Park's teaching methodology had been influenced by Elena's case. incorporating real-world ethical dilemmas that forced cadets to grapple with situations where institutional policy conflicted with individual conscience. Park's questions to his students were designed to push them beyond simple adherence to regulations toward a deeper understanding of military service as fundamentally about protecting human life. His classroom had become a laboratory for developing the kind of morally courageous leadership that the military desperately needed, but had historically struggled to cultivate. The changes in military education extended far beyond individual classrooms. The service academies had incorporated Elena's case into mandatory ethics curricula, requiring every future officer to study the circumstances that had led to her unauthorized rescue mission and to consider how they might respond to similar moral dilemmas. These educational reforms had been driven partly by a new generation of senior military leaders, many of whom had been junior officers when Elena's story first broke. These leaders understood that military effectiveness in the 21st century required personnel who could think critically about moral complexities, not just follow orders without question. General Patricia Williams, now the Air Force Chief of Staff, had been a colonel when Elena's court-martial had taken place. Williams had privately supported Elena's actions while publicly maintaining the institutional position that discipline must be upheld. Now, from her position at the apex of Air Force leadership, Williams had quietly implemented policies designed to prevent the kind of institutional failure that had made Elena's unauthorized action necessary. These policy changes included streamlined procedures for emergency humanitarian missions, expanded authority for field commanders to respond to crisis situations, and new training programs designed to help officers navigate the intersection of military discipline and moral obligation. The reforms represented a tacit acknowledgement that Elena's critics had been wrong about the dangers of individual moral judgment. The changes in military culture were reflected in the stories of officers who had been inspired by Elena's example to challenge institutional practices that prioritized bureaucratic efficiency over human welfare. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, Marcus Chen's sister and now a squadron commander, had built her leadership philosophy around the principle that military service was fundamentally about protecting people, not protecting institutions. Chen's squadron had achieved remarkable success in both training and operational missions by fostering an environment where junior officers were encouraged to think critically about orders and to speak up when they identified potential problems with planned operations. Her approach had initially been met with skepticism from senior leaders who worried about the impact on military discipline, but the results had been undeniably positive. The cultural changes extended beyond individual units to encompass broader military policies about whistleblowing and dissent. New regulations provided stronger protections for military personnel who reported safety concerns or ethical violations, reflecting a recognition that institutional loyalty sometimes required the courage to challenge institutional practices. Elena's influence on humanitarian aviation had created an entirely new sector within the field of international relief operations. The organization she had joined after her court-martial had grown into a major player in disaster response, operating a fleet of aircraft that rivaled many national air forces in capability and reach. The success of Elena's humanitarian work had attracted funding from sources ranging from private foundations to international aid organizations that recognized the value of having aviation assets capable of operating in conditions that defeated conventional relief efforts. Her reputation for accepting missions that other pilots considered impossible had made her organization the go-to choice for emergency operations in the world's most dangerous locations. Dr. Sarah Kim, now Elena's wife and the director of medical operations for their organization, had overseen the expansion of their humanitarian mission to include not just supply delivery, but comprehensive medical support for refugee populations and disaster victims. Their marriage had become a symbol of the kind of partnership that could emerge when people shared fundamental values about service to others. The couple's joint work had taken them to every continent, delivering aid to victims of natural disasters, armed conflicts, and humanitarian crises that the international community struggled to address through conventional channels. Each mission had reinforced their understanding that individual action guided by moral clarity could accomplish what institutional bureaucracy often could not. Elena's aircraft had evacuated civilians from Syrian war zones when diplomatic channels had failed to secure safe passage. She had delivered medical supplies to Ebola treatment centers in West Africa when commercial aviation had suspended operations due to health risks. She had provided disaster relief in Puerto Rico when government response had been delayed by bureaucratic complications. Each successful mission had added to Elena's legend within humanitarian circles, but more importantly, each had demonstrated that the skills developed through military service could be redirected toward purely humanitarian purposes without losing their effectiveness. Elena had proven that military training could serve life rather than death, protection rather than destruction. The soldiers Elena had rescued during her unauthorized mission had gone on to distinguished careers that carried forward the lessons they had learned from her example. Sergeant Major Maria Santos, now serving as the senior enlisted advisor to a division commander, had built her leadership philosophy around Elena's demonstration that true military service sometimes required the courage to disobey. Santos's influence on enlisted personnel throughout the Army had been profound, creating a generation of non-commissioned officers who understood that their primary obligation was to the welfare of their soldiers, not to the convenience of their commanders. Her leadership style emphasized initiative and moral courage, qualities that had been directly inspired by watching Elena risk everything to save lives. Master Sergeant David Rodriguez, another of the rescued soldiers, had become an instructor at the Army's Non-Commissioned Officer Academy, where he taught courses on military ethics and leadership. His curriculum included detailed analysis of Elena's rescue mission, using her example to illustrate the importance of individual moral courage and military effectiveness. Rodriguez's students were taught to think of Elena's unauthorized action not as disobedience, but as the highest form of military service, demonstrating that true loyalty to military values sometimes required challenging military authority. His influence on future NCO leaders had helped create a culture where protection of human life took precedence over bureaucratic compliance. The families of the rescued soldiers had become powerful advocates for military personnel who faced moral dilemmas in the course of their service. Their advocacy had contributed to policy changes that provided better support for service members who reported ethical violations or safety concerns. Recognizing that institutional loyalty sometimes required challenging institutional practices, these families had maintained contact with Elena throughout her civilian career, creating an extended network of support that transcended traditional boundaries between military and civilian communities. Their children had grown up with Elena as a family friend, learning from her example that individual courage could make a difference in situations where institutional power had failed. Elena's story had influenced popular culture in ways that extended military service into broader discussions about individual responsibility and moral courage. Books, documentaries, and films had explored her story as an example of how personal integrity could triumph over institutional pressure, inspiring audiences who face their own moral dilemmas in various professional and personal contexts. The Hollywood film Storm Warning, loosely based on Elena's story, had introduced her example to millions of viewers who might never have encountered military ethics otherwise. While the film had taken considerable dramatic license with the actual events, it had succeeded in communicating the core message that individual moral courage could accomplish what institutional authority could not. More importantly, serious academic works had analyzed Elena's case as an example of civil disobedience within military contexts, exploring the philosophical and legal implications of her actions for broader questions about obedience to authority and individual moral responsibility. These scholarly examinations had elevated Elena's story from a simple tale of military heroism to a complex case study in applied ethics. The international attention Elena's case had received had also influenced military policies in allied nations, many of which had re-examined their own procedures for handling situations where military discipline conflicted with humanitarian imperatives. Several NATO allies had implemented policy changes directly inspired by lessons learned from Elena's experience. The Norwegian military had established new protocols for rapid humanitarian response that streamlined authorization procedures for emergency missions. The Canadian Armed Forces had created ombudsman positions specifically designed to handle cases where service members identified conflicts between orders and moral obligations. The Australian military had expanded training programs focused on ethical decision-making under pressure. These international policy changes reflected a growing recognition that Elena's case had revealed universal problems within military institutions, not just issues specific to American military culture. The moral complexities she had faced were inherent in any system that required individuals to balance institutional loyalty against individual conscience. Elena's influence on military justice had been equally significant, contributing to reforms in military legal systems that had traditionally prioritized discipline over individual circumstances. Military courts had begun incorporating more nuanced understanding of moral complexity into their proceedings, recognizing that not all violations of regulations represented failures of character or judgment. The precedent set by Elena's case had been cited in numerous subsequent court-martial proceedings where service members had violated orders in order to protect human life or prevent greater harm. While not all such cases had resulted in lenient sentences, Elena's example had established that moral motivation could be considered a mitigating factor in military legal proceedings. Military legal advocates had also used Elena's case to argue for expanded protections for service members who reported safety violations or ethical concerns within their units. These advocacy efforts had contributed to policy changes that provided better support for military whistleblowers and stronger protections against retaliation for reporting misconduct. The psychological impact of Elena's story on military personnel who faced similar moral dilemmas had been profound but difficult to quantify. Military mental health professionals had noted increased willingness among service members to seek counseling when faced with conflicts between orders and conscience, suggesting that Elena's example had reduced the stigma associated with questioning authority. Military chaplains had reported more frequent consultations from personnel struggling with ethical dilemmas related to their service, indicating that Elena's story had encouraged greater awareness of moral complexity within military service. These conversations had led to expanded ethics training and better support systems for personnel facing difficult moral choices. The broader impact on military culture had been reflected in recruitment materials and retention programs that emphasized the moral dimensions of military service. The services had begun highlighting examples of moral courage and ethical leadership in their promotional materials, recognizing that younger generations of potential recruits were attracted to organizations that valued individual conscience alongside institutional loyalty. Elena's continuing humanitarian work had provided ongoing examples of how military skills could be redirected toward purely constructive purposes. Her annual reports to donors and supporters documented thousands of lives saved through medical evacuations, supply deliveries, and disaster response operations that would have been impossible without her unique combination of flying skills and moral courage. The organization Elena worked for had become a model for other humanitarian groups seeking to provide rapid response capabilities in crisis situations. Their success had demonstrated that former military personnel could be valuable assets in humanitarian work, bringing skills and experience that complemented rather than contradicted the humanitarian mission. Elena's speaking engagements at humanitarian conferences and military academies had helped bridge the gap between military and civilian approaches to service, demonstrating that the fundamental motivation to protect human life was common to both military service and humanitarian work. Her presentations had inspired career changes among both military personnel seeking more direct humanitarian impact and civilians interested in applying their skills to emergency response. The personal satisfaction Elena had found in her humanitarian work had provided a powerful counter-narrative to the trauma of her court-martial and dismissal from military service. While she would never fully recover from the loss of her military career, her civilian work had proven that her fundamental motivation to save lives could find expression outside military institutions. Elena's marriage to Dr. Kim had produced 2 children who were growing up with an understanding that their parents' work was fundamentally about helping others in desperate situations. The children's exposure to humanitarian missions had given them a global perspective and deep appreciation for the privileges they enjoyed as Americans, while also understanding that those privileges came with obligations to help others. The family's annual Christmas letters had become legendary within their extended network of friends and supporters, documenting missions to disaster zones and conflict areas alongside typical family milestones. These letters had helped maintain connections between Elena and the military community she had once served, demonstrating that her commitment to service had continued despite her change in institutional affiliation. Elena's reflection on her own journey from military disgrace to humanitarian hero had revealed the unexpected benefits of being forced to leave military service. While she would never have chosen the path that led to her court-martial, she had come to understand that her dismissal from the Air Force had freed her to pursue the kind of direct humanitarian impact that military bureaucracy would never have allowed. The autonomy Elena enjoyed in her civilian work had allowed her to respond immediately to humanitarian crises without waiting for authorization from distant bureaucrats who might prioritize political considerations over human need. Her ability to make rapid decisions based purely on humanitarian criteria had enabled her organization to save lives in situations where institutional response would have been too slow to be effective. Elena's story had also demonstrated the resilience of individuals who chose moral courage over institutional security. Despite losing her military career, benefits, and social standing, she had rebuilt her life around work that was even more directly aligned with her fundamental values than military service had ever been. The 10th anniversary of Elena's court-martial had prompted renewed attention to her story, with military and civilian publications examining the long-term impact of her unauthorized rescue mission on military culture and humanitarian aviation. These retrospective analyses had generally concluded that Elena's case had catalyzed positive changes that had made both military service and humanitarian work more effective and morally grounded. Elena herself had marked the anniversary quietly, with a private ceremony attended by the families of the soldiers she had rescued and colleagues from her humanitarian work. The event had been less about celebrating her personal story than about honoring the ongoing commitment to service that connected military veterans, active duty personnel, and humanitarian workers in a common mission of protecting human life. As Elena prepared for another dangerous mission, this time a medical evacuation from a remote region of Somalia, where tribal conflict had left dozens of civilians requiring emergency treatment, she reflected on the unexpected trajectory her life had taken since that fateful decision to defy orders and save lives. The woman who had been condemned by military authority for putting human life above institutional loyalty had found a way to continue that work on an even larger scale. Elena Vasquez had proven that true service transcended institutional boundaries, that moral courage could triumph over bureaucratic cowardice, and that individual action guided by conscience could accomplish what collective decision-making could not. Her legacy lived on not in official records or institutional memory, but in the lives of people who had been saved by her courage and inspired by her example to choose conscience over compliance, service over safety, and love over fear. Sarah looked out her apartment window at the Colorado landscape that had been her home for 3 years, understanding that she was saying goodbye to more than just geography. The person she'd tried to become was disappearing forever, replaced by the warrior who'd always been waiting beneath the surface. "I'm ready." The conversation ended with arrangements for Sarah's immediate reintegration into a world she'd never truly left. Her extraordinary demonstration had achieved more than vindication of her abilities. It had announced her return to active service in circumstances that made retreat impossible. That evening, as Sarah packed the few possessions that connected her to her civilian identity, she reflected on the chain of events that had brought her full circle. Sergeant Matthews' casual cruelty had awakened something that 3 years of careful anonymity couldn't suppress. Her public demonstration had proven that vision was about far more than reading charts, and that some capabilities couldn't be judged by conventional standards. The warrior Sarah had tried to bury was fully resurrected now, called back to service by a country that needed abilities forged in classified crucibles and honed through experiences that officially never happened. The careful balance between past and present was permanently disrupted, but for the first time in years, Sarah felt the satisfaction that came from being exactly who she was meant to be. The next morning, Sarah Chen, store clerk from Millfield, Colorado, disappeared forever. In her place stood someone whose vision problems had never affected her ability to see what truly mattered, whose extraordinary capabilities had been proven beyond doubt, and whose service to her country was just beginning again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.